Hello and welcome to another episode of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, today I wanted to talk about essentially conditions and how it applies to unconditional love as we see it here in society and the way that it's meant by the church. Because unconditional love is something that's articulated a lot in various different ways, especially when we talk about the way that God loves us. So I wanted to start by talking about the way that I view conditions in the way that they are in my head, because maybe I have some preconceived notions that are correct or maybe incorrect, but I think they're probably the common ways that people think of conditions when placed upon relationships, placed upon feelings, interactions with each other, and stuff like that. So let's start with like the most basic simplistic one I can think of, which is essentially the employee-employer relationship. It's conditional that I will keep coming to work as long as you keep paying me, and you're going to keep paying me to come to work as long as I do what I'm supposed to do as an employee. So very basic kind of transactional type thing. You can also look at it as a consumer. I'll give you $5, you give me this product. That type of conditions, transactional conditions. And I look at those as like, okay, there's a place in society for that. That makes sense. I expect this, that, or the other out of my employees, out of the products I'm buying. I want to make sure, that they're actually going to do what they're saying. The meat's not spoiled and I'm not going to get sick and all that stuff. So it makes sense why society has those types of conditions within it. I use that as the framework starting point because as we move into other relationships, more interpersonal relationships, the way that we work with each other kind of has some of these pre-built notions into it. We're going to be friends with each other because we treat each other the way we want to be treated. And each relationship might have a little different way that is. I treat my dad differently than I treat, like my best friend. And I think that those types of expectations are expected. They're kind of reasonable for society. I can't go out and tackle my son the same way I would tackle my brother when we were at football. It just wouldn't work. So I bring that up because in a sense, all of those examples are conditions, exceptions, expectations, whatever the appropriate word is on relationships that we put with each other. And they're all kind of viewed as normal, if not necessary. So where I want to take this conversation is if these conditions are expected, what does the concept of unconditional love actually mean? Because to take that to the next step, well, let's start there and then get some groundwork laid.
Yeah, no, that's great, Joe. I really, this is an example of the value of our conversation because you come from a perspective that I think is very relatable to people, and the language that you use is, 21st century American, and so that's and you're very thoughtful, and you're paying attention to the things around you, and you're finding a way to express that, and I live in a monastery and I live in the language of the church and some of these things. So it's nice to kind of piece that together. I really appreciate that. Um, and I think the way that this would fit together is when you're talking about conditions and contracts, we usually think about that under the virtue of justice. So justice, in our Catholic understanding, simply said, is to give to each according to his due. So we give according to what we owe. And we establish those sorts of expectations, what we owe to one person as opposed to another. And so, like what you described about an employer and employee, they enter into a contract, and the foundation for their interactions is a justice mutually agreed upon in freedom. And then they bind themselves to uh, live out their part of that, the employer to work, the employee to, or the employer to pay the employee to work, and other things as well. I mean, the employer to treat the employee in certain ways. And we literally have contracts for employment that indicate what the terms of the contract are, and living those out, being faithful to those is a matter of justice. And that's what we call the virtue associated with that behavior, is again justice. Now some of that is established by convention, according to positive law. Some of it is expected and would be part of natural law. So you wouldn't put in a contract normally things like, you know, the employer is not going to scream and yell at the employee and shame them and um, force them to do whatever, their work or something like that. Or the employer isn't going to, there's some things we expect under natural law. You're going to behave like a human being and you're going to treat the other person with the rights of a human being. So we have a sense of natural rights, of human rights that would accord in every situation. And so, in terms of justice and rights giving to each according to his due, when we have a particular relationship governed by a certain contract, whether it's spelled out explicitly or in the case of, I don't know. I mean, we have so many things that are really spelled out explicitly these days.
Mhm.
But the way that we might behave towards a neighbor, or sometimes there are property laws, but we sort of like understand whatever. If the baseball goes over, you're going to get the baseball from the other person's yard, and we have a number of things that are sort of floating implicit agreements that break down when things become aggressive and argumentative, and when trust is damaged and people want to lawyer up and fight it from a legal perspective. So, but normally we have things either spelled out or they're somewhat implicit. And then you mentioned also some kinds of cultural adaptations that uh, we have there's certain levels of trust in our own family. We're really going beyond justice at that point. So we can think of just basic justice as the kind of thing, I'm going to go into a store, I'm going to give you money, you're going to give me the product. You're not going to yell at me when I come into the store. I'm not going to yell at you when I am
Mhm.
there or when I leave, or whatever. I'm not going to break things. I'm not going to do, there's a number of just basic things about basic human interactions where we respect each other and we give to each according to what they're due. And then there are certain ways we go beyond that. I think we could say something like, I have the right to my private space, and that's a matter of justice. But in certain relationships, I extend that right, or I relax that right because I trust the person. And now we're really going beyond justice into the realm of charity, where trust is involved, a different kind of trust. And I'm opening myself, and so when we have two friends who are doing a business deal, we might trust each other. And so before we sign contracts, or maybe even without signing contracts, you go over and you work on your friend's house and you do it for free. Or, there's a deal, he's going to pay you a couple beers and you're going to hang out, he's going to help you a certain amount. We do these kinds of flexible things when we move into the realm of charity and trust in relationships, and we're not just meeting the minimum standard of justice. Now, charity and trust don't make it right to be unjust. So that's presuming justice. Charity is always presuming justice
Mhm.
and then going beyond it with a flexibility, a relaxation of justice for the sake of charity, for making a gift to the other. So I think that covered more or less what you're aiming at there.
Yeah, certainly. It definitely started the starting point there, and I'm really glad I stopped because the second part is building upon what you just said there. And this, when we talk about starting with our relationships with others, but they're all, as I've kind of advertised Father and Joe, it's all kind of under the relationship that we have with God, and the way that it's articulated through the Bible, looking at it starting with the Old Testament. At least the way I see it, the pivotal moment of the Old Testament is when Moses comes down with the commandments. And in those, I kind of look at it as those are the conditions in which you're supposed to live. The first three being about your relationship with God, and then the other seven, your relationship with others. But as you said, that to me flows with the answer you just gave me. It starts with this justice-based relationship that we need to have basics, and then as we can grow into trust, almost using your example as the relationship that he has with the nation of Israel, just it's over a millennium instead of over the time span that we have in a lifetime, but how we get to the ultimate form of charity in Jesus. Is that me trying to force something into a wrong hole, or is that the message you're supposed to receive in this context?
Yeah, so God reveals in terms of how some of that is developed from the Ten Commandments, which are really accessible to everyone. They're just made explicit again to Israel. And so when we talk about the Ten Commandments, the one that's up in the air is whether you'd know what day the Sabbath was. But really, the proposal is anyway that, and across history, we've seen it not perfectly in every culture, but across all cultures, we see a convergence on the Ten Commandments as something accessible to natural human reason when we're at our best.
Mhm.
But God made that explicit with Israel, plus a whole additional dimension of God's self revelation, his particular love for Israel, a way that they could offer sacrifice and give thanks in return, and even a code that went a little beyond justice in terms of caring for the alien, the sojourner, the slaves, even. So there's more there. Plus, God's revelation, journeying with the people of Israel, revealing His name to them, and drawing them into a covenant that also had a promise and rites of worship. And so, what He does with Israel is then going really beyond the kind of standard for the human race that we would establish through natural law. Again, essentially the Ten Commandments. God reveals more of Himself to Israel and also asks more of Israel in response. And so their covenant goes beyond the kind of basic contract, you might say, of God with the human race. And then that takes another step in God's further self revelation. He makes Himself even more vulnerable by sending His Son, who comes through Israel, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and is obedient. Jesus is himself a Jew. He's a member of the nation of Israel, and he then extends a new and eternal covenant to us in His own blood, and that has an additional. Now He's really giving us even more, and He's asking even more from us. He's calling us even further beyond justice into a greater and greater level of charity, even the perfection of charity, which He models for us in His own person.
So I guess to ask that, to conclude that question, is based on everything you told me, the Ten Commandments, and this is where I want to start diving into like what is unconditional love. The Ten Commandments are not placing conditions upon love. It's not that you become unworthy of love if you break one of the Ten Commandments. You lied, so therefore you're not worthy of being loved or anything like that. It is much more than that. And that's kind of the part where I want to take the second half of this conversation to: how does unconditional love apply, first starting with the relationship with God and then becoming applicable in the way that grace comes to us in our individual relationships?
Yeah, so unconditional love again is presuming justice and then going far beyond it. It's a love that even when you fail to live up to your side of the agreement, I still love you. Even when you fall short of what you promised, I still love you. Even when you have nothing to offer and we couldn't enter into a certain kind of contract, I still love you. That's where unconditional love comes in, and that's what God reveals that He has for us. Now, that's discernible from the fact that we exist. God created us, and we had nothing, we had no way to earn that because we didn't exist. God brought us out of nothing by His own gratuitous love. And He is committed to remaining with us, helping us to grow, and drawing us to live eternally with Himself. Again, through no merit of our own, just because He loves us and He initiates that unconditional love for us. And then He's inviting our response, that love, having received, it's built into the structure of our being that love wants to respond to love. And so He's loving us into an unconditional response of love by initiating unconditional love with us. And so He starts the chain reaction, you might say, and then He helps each of those that He has revealed that love to, that He has loved, to love one another also unconditionally. Now, again, that's well, anyway, maybe I'll stop there. I want to qualify that 7 different ways, but
Fair enough.
it's it's true what I said, so I'll leave it there.
So to take part of what you said there about how love wants to be with other love, I think that we can naturally see that in a lot of different environments. People tend to hang out with people who are similar to them, not just because of similar interests, because obviously that is important. Doing similar things with each other is important, but also in this scale of, I know I don't want to hang out with someone who does this type of behavior because I just don't want to have that to be part of my life. And kind of society puts themselves in these own little categories, niches, depending upon what world you're in, trying to communicate these groups. But on one sense, there's people who just say, I don't want to be around anyone who ever drinks, like at all. Like I want to keep that completely out of my life and my family's life. And then they just hang out with other people like that. And on the other hand, there's people who literally go to a bar every day and just talk to each other all the time there. Now, that doesn't mean that one group is holier or more worthy of love than another, but it does mean that if you try to mix those two groups together, they're going to need to find a different comparison to get together. It's going to be like, we need to figure something else out here. And that's a normal thing of society. And I don't think that there's any way that we should try to change that, because I don't think it's possible to change. I think that would be like trying to do something that's unnatural. But that's also a fact of life, and that you have these two groups that found their own happiness within themselves, but wouldn't be compatible together. So I want to try, I don't know if I'm articulating that well or not, but that concept and how it applies within the realm of unconditional love in which we're all called to be in.
Right. So we do have what we might call like specialty groups, and we see that already in the family, of course, which is the building block of society. Uh, the individual is not the building block of society. The family is the building block of society. And so society is built on relationships, just as God himself is not individual. He is a communion of love, a relationship. You could say a family, although that would be just by analogy. But anyway, um, the family is the building block of society. And of course, the family is already a nexus of relationships. And those are relationships primarily built on unconditional love. So now there is a kind of rights and duties structure within families that, for parents to bring children into the world, they commit to caring for them. And there's a whole series of things around that. Children, likewise, are to repay their parents. And here we talk about a specialization of the virtue of justice. We call it piety. And it has, because a child can't, strictly speaking, repay the parents what they're due, because the parents have given the child life, which the child can never repay. The child can never give the parents life. So it's a little different structure, and we call that piety. It's a specialized version or a sub virtue of the virtue of justice. And so that relationship of parents and children is built around a certain structure of rights and duties of justice. But then, both are called, obviously, to move to a place of unconditional love, that parents don't just fulfill their duties, they love their children unconditionally, no matter what the children are capable of, or whether they return the love, or whether they go astray, or whether they do all kinds of things that a lot of parents experience based on what they're telling me. So um, we move toward unconditional love in those relationships. Likewise, children for parents, even when their parents start to lose their mental faculties, or when their parents are poor and unable to provide, or even when their parents are difficult in some way. Now, even in the case where parents are abusive, we have to contextualize that a little bit. There can still be a love there, although sometimes the relationships require separation if the relationships become destructive. That's a whole episode in itself. Anyway, so everything builds on the structure of the family, and then from the position of the family, I relate to the world. So I relate to the world initially as the son of my father, as the son of my mother. So I already relate relationally then with the rest of the world, and we move from our particular identity defined by our relationships in the family outward into relationships with everyone and everyone else. And a similar kind of thing happens in groups. So Catholics, for example, relate to the rest of the religions as Catholics, or even within the Catholic Church, that somebody's in the Rosary Altar Society, another person is, a Benedictine oblate, and another person is a sacristan or something like that, or they have their own groups. And those specialization groups that are not for everyone are still part of what forms an identity, and that becomes the position from which we reach out to and interact with others. I interact with others as a member of this group. I interact within the group, and then towards the outside world or outside the group, I interact as a member in the group. And that helps to establish my identity. So it's not a goal to eliminate all specialty groups or whatever. They actually help us to reach out. But it's also not a goal to limit our interactions to specialty groups. We are in a specialty group, and then we have an outward facing posture towards the rest of the church, the rest of the world. And we relate better because we belong to a smaller group. We relate better with the larger group, until ultimately, everybody becomes a family of families, that in Christ we have a universal family, and we are all brothers and sisters, and we experience that closeness. That's what we're growing toward, and that's what heaven looks like.
Beautiful. And that certainly made sense here. I want to continue this conversation here in the next episode, as we're kind of drawing on time here. But yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. We thank everyone out there for listening and sharing. Please continue to share us as we've been growing as a result of you, and we will be with you guys here next week.